Great, thanks for the introduction. So we have a handful of people on already, but I expect some more to join here shortly. So I'll get started with just a brief introduction on me and a little bit of background. I have been in this space for over 20 years, love what I do. I started off in finance and accounting, and it just wasn't my cup of tea. So I got into the technology, and for me it's great because I get to keep one foot in the finance side and one foot in the technology side, and I get to do kind of what I love and the best of both worlds. So I really enjoy doing these series, these presentations. I used to teach at a college for 5 years, so I get a lot of it's just a lot of satisfaction for me to share knowledge and learn from you guys as well. If you want to get a hold of me, there's a couple ways you can do it. You can go to intohyperion.com and contact me there. You can also email me at kgoodfriend@ACCELYTICS.com. Couple other brief information pieces here is if you go to Into Hyperion, you can sign up to receive emails, and there's nothing in there that I sell or distribute. It's just you get an email a couple times a month when there's a new post or there's an update like ODTUG presentation that I think might be valuable or something like that. You can also go to LinkedIn and you can download this presentation later. I don't expect you to remember this, but there's a link there for LinkedIn for Into Hyperion, and I also post things there to get information to people. A little bit about ACCELYTICS, and I'll keep this short because I know that this isn't what you guys are here for, but our success starts with employee focus and a relentless focus on our client success. We really, really care about the people that we work with and our clients, and the people that are on our team are crazy focused, and they work really, really hard, sometimes way too much to make everybody around them better and happy. We have expertise in a number of places: supply chain, financial planning, and sales performance management. And our consultants are both functional and technical, kind of like me, where they've had a foot on both sides. One of the things that we're really proud of is that we maintain 100% customer referenceability, 100% on-time project delivery, 100% on budget delivery, and we are 100% onshore domestic resources. So one other real quick thing on Into Hyperion is if you're interested in this Groovy stuff, and if you've heard me talk before, you know how excited I am at some of the functionality and what it opens up for us to be able to do for the users. There's a Groovy series on Into Hyperion that is, I think it's at 33 now, and I want to get up to 50, and then I'll probably stop doing them. But there's a ton of information out there that's free to obtain. There's videos and all kinds of things that'll help you take what you learned today and take it to the next step. We already talked about the webinar format. I will do the best I can to try to look at those questions that you put in the chat and answer those throughout the webinar. This is a little bit difficult for me because I really like to see people. I like to see facial expressions, and I like it to be interactive. So the fact that I can't see you guys and hear you guys is a little bit odd for me, and I'll do the best I can to try to interact as much as possible with those questions and keep this interesting. So the way we're going to go through this is we're going to talk about Groovy at a high level, what the API are. I'm going to show you a couple demos of some use cases, and then we're going to jump right into actually how to write Groovy. And we're going to start with a hello world and then move into other options, and we'll probably get a little bit more complicated as we go through this, and hopefully it'll all make sense. And again, if you have a question, please post it in that chat, especially when we're going through these examples, because I can't see if you're confused or not. So we'll try to keep it, like I said, as interactive as possible. So Groovy has a ton to offer. The real-time synchronization between models is incredibly beneficial. So if you guys have used planning before or even SBase before, a lot of the things and the frustrations you'll get are people can't see consolidated numbers immediately. If you're impacting or if you're editing workforce or CapEx or some product model, you can't see the total impact right away. all that stuff goes away. So things like planners, they can see the changes of any properties they make on any employee at a total immediately. And when I say immediately, I mean within seconds. So by the time they would run a report, it's updated. CFOs can get real-time, fully consolidated P&L reports at any time of the day. Your P&L managers can make changes and see the net impact right away. So if it doesn't hit the number that they want, they can go back in and change it. They don't have to wait until later in the day. Planners can make changes, like I said, and see the impacts immediately. All those things, it sounds nice, but the impact that it makes to your users is incredibly awesome, and the performance is just crazy good. So we'll go through some examples of that today. The other thing that is somewhat overlooked is the ability to validate data before it's submitted. So prior to Groovy, we had to submit the data, and then you could respond back to a user and say that something was wrong or that the rate that they entered was too high and they need to fix it, but you really couldn't stop them from making those incorrect data entries. And you had to assume that they would go back in and fix it, which obviously doesn't always happen. So the planners can be a lot more confident in the numbers that they're submitting, and drivers can be in acceptable ranges. I mean, there's just a lot of things that you can do to stop them from shooting themselves in the foot in a budgeting process. And the benefit of that is that they don't have these fire drills at the end when they realize that, you know, they didn't fully allocate a number or so on. So again, we've already talked about these. I'm not going to go through those again, but this is just kind of a summary of what I just talked about. A couple other things that I didn't talk about is executing business logic outside of SBase. So one of the things that's actually really cool with this is you can actually track all the history. So it's not just the number that the person changed, but it's all the numbers that that person impacted by the change that they made. So you can see that cell history for everything if you decide to do something like this. You have access to Java functions, which opens up a whole new world of things that we can do that we either couldn't do in SBase calculations or were not very efficient to do. You can do traffic lighting, advanced traffic lighting, and I'll go through some examples of these to show you the difference between what's already built in and what Groovy can do. You can customize errors and return messages for languages. You can customize the logs. You can even perform metadata straight from a form and a calculation now. So that opens up a lot of opportunities that we didn't have before. And then the real-time synchronization with strategic modeling. So if you do have strategic modeling, you can actually move that data back and forth real time, and it'll always be up to date. I get this question a lot about who has the access to use Groovy, and it's really pretty simple. It's EPBCS and PBCS plus 1. And if you haven't used or don't know what PBCS plus 1 is, it's really just PBCS plus one of the modules that you can buy, and the price point is somewhere between PBCS and EPBCS. So we do have some clients that go that way. You do have the ability to access Groovy on-premise, and I get this question a lot. It's very different. So in on-premise, you can actually shell out from, or you can create a custom defined function basically and have some Groovy or Java runtime application return results back to the calculation and then do something with it. It's very different than what we have in PBCS, because in PBCS it's actually real-time integrated with the forms. You can interact with the forms and those types of things, which you cannot do with on-premise. And from what I've been told from development, they don't have any anticipation of moving that or making that available in on-premise. So if you want to use this kind of technology, then you're probably stuck using the cloud. So Groovy introduction, and I'm not going to read this. A lot of people know what Groovy is, but it's basically a platform that sits on top of Java that, in my opinion, makes it much easier to use for somebody that's not a Java programmer. So it's a little bit less restrictive from defining variables and garbage collection and things like that. The benefits to PBCS, again, we've talked about these. You have access to do all kinds of things that you didn't have before. You've got access to the API, traffic lighting, runtime prompt validation, pre-save, form validation, and so on. So this is really just reiterating what I've already talked about in a little bit more detail. So you have access to Groovy, and Groovy uses the the EPBCS API. And API is an application programming interface, so it basically allows multiple applications to communicate to each other. And the easiest way, or the simplest way I can kind of lay this out, is you've got these things called classes, and these are objects that expose functions. So things like application and cube and member and operation and data map are some of the classes that we have available. And if you think of the methods that might be available to some of those classes, you can probably kind of figure out what they are before you even look them up. But things like a data map, you have the ability to execute a data map. Member, you have the ability to get member information from a member. Application, you can create a smart push from the application. So all those things basically interact. So you've got these objects almost that are classes, and then you've got properties and methods that are in those classes that you can use to actually do something. So, and I don't know if this is a great explanation, but again, this is coming from somebody that is not a programmer at heart and doesn't have a programming background. But to me, if Groovy is the driver of a car, the API is kind of the mechanisms and the things that we have to interact with the car. So if you think of Groovy as the driver, these methods and classes would be things like the steering wheel. So if I turn left on the steering wheel, it does an action, it makes the car go left. If I press the brake pedal, then that makes the car stop. If I press the gas pedal, it makes it go faster, and so on. And hopefully that makes sense. Again, turn signals, windshield wipers, and so on. And I'm gonna pause here and turn off some notifications real quick. So some common methods, and I'm gonna go through this kind of quick, and we'll go through these in a little bit more detail. This is just some of the things that I think you guys will probably use most often. Things like operation grid.grid.cell iterator. So this gives you the ability to loop through cells to figure out which cells have been changed, to do validation on those cells and those types of things. Application or operation.application.getDataMap.createSmartPush.execute. So you can grab a data map, you can create a smart push from it, because users don't have the ability, unless they're an admin, to use data maps. You have to create a smart push from it. And then you can customize that with parameters inside of those quotes, which we'll go into. Things like runtime prompts. It's real easy, RTPS dot, and then the name of the runtime prompt. Getting the POV from the dimensions, or getting the dimension and member list from the POV, very, very simple. Operation.grid.POV star.dim name, that's going to give you a list of all the dimensions that are in the POV. Same thing, S-base member name, it's going to give you all of the S-base member names that are in that POV. Very useful for things like customizing fixed statements, customizing data pushes, and things like that. Again, we'll get into some of this, but I just wanted to give you guys an idea of what some of this stuff looks like. The get POV as a map is an example that you guys will use a lot. I'll get into that in a little bit because I think it'll confuse you if I talk about it right now. Get any member based on a dimension name. So these are things, you're going to need these for things like fixed statements and variables and stuff. So if you do operation.grid.pov.find, and then inside of that it.dim name equals, and then whatever the dimension you're looking at, .s-space member name, it'll give you the member name for that dimension. Again, all the time you're going to be using this to get things like, to get the member names for things like fixed statements and prompts and those types of things. And if you've used this before, you will probably ask why I do it this way. And there's probably 3, 4, 5 different ways to actually get member names from a POV. So this isn't the right way or the wrong way, it's just one of the ways. So before I get into the use cases, I'm going to jump over and see if anybody has asked any questions, and I don't see any. So for the sake of trying to get through some of the introductory stuff, I went through that kind of quickly. I'm going to slow down a little bit. So we've been in this 15 minutes, we've got about 45 minutes left. So I'm going to try to slow down and actually go through some use cases and then go through the code so that you guys understand it. But again, I want this to be interactive as much as we possibly can. So if I'm going too fast, or if you have a question about something, there's almost 60 people on this. So if you have the question, somebody else probably does too. So go ahead and ask the question, and I'll stop and pause and try to answer those questions so that I don't go through this too quickly and you guys are totally confused when I'm finished. So use cases, I'm going to go over to PBS and just show you some of the things. And again, this Groovy basically allows you to do anything that you really want. The only limitation is your creativity and knowledge, basically. So these examples aren't the only things you can do. They're just some of the things that I think are kind of neat to demonstrate and just show you the flexibility. So I'm going to go in and just show you some of the validation that you can do. So this is a form where I can add new products. So I'm going to actually delete this one real quick. So this is a prompt. You can actually base this off of a drop-down list or a smart list, and it's just a confirmation. Hey, user, are you sure you want to delete this? And if they click yes and hit launch, then it goes through and deletes it. If they click no, then it doesn't delete anything and it goes right back to the form the way it was. So that's just one example of a validation that you can do on a runtime prompt. The next thing I'm going to do is add a new product. So if I go in and add a new product, and I've got some restrictions in here that do not allow me to use special characters. So let's say maybe you're going to use this product name as a member name at some point so that you don't want any special characters to be in here to make it easy. So if I type in iPhone @red and I launch this, it's going to tell me that there are special characters in here and only alphanumeric characters are allowed. And I spelled characters wrong, so that's awesome. But just to give you an example, right? If I just put in, iPhone red, then it would allow me to add this product. And again, you can customize this. This isn't a pre-form or a function that currently exists. You say what you're allowed to have and what you're not. One of the other things is I do not allow anything more than 20 characters. So if somebody typed in 21 characters, then it would not allow them to save that. So some other things that I think are actually kind of cool. This product level input, if I put in, right now we have a restriction that it has to be between -10 and 30%. So if I type in 35% and try to save this, it's going to come back and tell me that it's outside of the range that's acceptable. Now notice, this data has not been set back to the database, so it's not saved anywhere. So if they cancel this, there's no data back in the database. If I hit refresh, it's going to go back to blank. So you'll notice that I added a tooltip that says that this has been modified and it's outside an acceptable range. It also says that if you want to enter something outside of that range, an explanation is required. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to add a comment. So let's just say that I want to have this at a higher percentage because it's a new product and we feel that there's going to be some high return on it. So if I go ahead and add that comment, now it has a comment and you can see it with the little green box right there. Now when I hit save, it's going to come back and say that's fine. So those are the types of things that you can do. You can get really, really creative and really help your users out by having some of this validation. There's all kinds of things we can do. I've got a form here where it allows you to adjust preset limits. So if I scroll over here to the right, this column over here are the seeded amounts. So notice that I have 175 here in January, and I've got 175 in I think every month. So if I come over here and put in -180 and add that 180 to February and try to save this, it's going to come back and tell me that I can't do that because I can't have negative units in a month. So if I put my cursor over there, it goes in and says that, hey, that this adjustment of negative 180 would cause a negative almost 5 units in that month. So I can't let you do that. If I change this to say 170 and leave February at 1, or let's say if I make it minus 50 and I leave February at 180, I've also got a restriction that says that you can't change the number of units for the total year. So if you decrease 1 by 50, you have to add 50 to other months. So again, if I try to save this, it's going to come back and tell me that that violates that rule, and it doesn't let me save it. Again, nothing saved back to the database. So if I go up and refresh this, you'll see that there's no data there. So hopefully that inspires you to see some of the possibilities that we can do. The other one that's a little bit less friendly for a demo is the real-time data movement. But if I would have saved those changes in that form, that is actually in a product level plan type. If I go to the P&L plan type, it doesn't have product level data. I would actually see the impact of that change as fast as I save that form. So again, we'll get into how you do some of that in a little bit, but all I can do from a demonstration perspective is actually change the number and then show you that the totals change, which isn't real exciting to do. So again, certainly not limited to just those examples. You can really do whatever you want because you have the ability to interact at a cell level and put validation on any line, on any cell, for anything that you want, because Groovy allows you to check math, strings, really anything that you want to do. So it's really, like I said, I get really excited about this. It's really useful, and the people that see this are really just, the users love it. So it's really awesome. All right, so I'm going to go and we're going to walk into the demonstration. So I'm going to actually jump in. All right, so we have a couple questions. The first one, how does Oracle support view Groovy? If we utilize and have an outage, how much would Oracle help? So I think what you're asking is if you use Groovy and you have an error in your Groovy calculation, how much will Oracle help? So this is supported. I mean, it's a supported function, and PBCS is actually built on top of Groovy. So, they'll support it as much as they do a calc script. Are they going to write it for you and tell you what exactly you're doing wrong if you can't get one to work? Probably not. But they do support it, and it is part of the product. So I hope that answers your question. I'm guessing a little bit. How these validations are different than validation rule available in on-premise Hyperion. Okay, so I think the question is, how are they different than? I don't think it's any different in on-prem and PBCS. You've got the validation in the rules or in the forms itself. So I believe if it's still the same in on-prem, you actually have a server level setting that you can actually change the validation so it stops the form from submitting, but it's not a form level setting. It's an application. I think it's a server level setting. And in PBCS, you don't have that opportunity. All you have is the ability to traffic light if something doesn't happen. So if you're talking about on-prem, how is it different if you change that setting? So the difference, the same thing would be that it won't let you save the form. The difference is you have flexibility to do anything that you want to do. It's like in the example that I said where if there was something that was outside of a range, it stops it, but it lets you, if you put a comment, you wouldn't have that ability in on-prem. So it's way more flexible. And again, it's form level, so you don't have to change a server setting. So you can have warnings, you can let them save it, but you can traffic light. And if you're comparing it to the version that's in PBCS, PBCS doesn't force them or doesn't stop the save from actually happening. It just traffic lights it when you break some validation rule. So that doesn't really do a whole lot other than tell them that it's wrong and ask them to fix it. And you also don't have nearly the flexibility like the example I just gave, where if it's outside of a range, it's okay if they have a comment. Next question, we have a composite form with 3 tabs with preventative validations in all 3 tabs. Is there a function or class that allows the user to enter save data in any or all of the tabs? If there isn't any anomaly in either of the tabs but prevents the user if there is one in either of the tabs. So I think the question is if there's if a violation is broken in one of the tabs in the composite views, does it stop the other views from saving? That's actually a great question and something that I'll test and try to get back to the group. I don't know the answer to that. All right, so those are the questions we had. I'm going to jump back into starting off how to actually write some Groovy calculations. All right, so the first thing is setting a calculation, excuse me, to be a Groovy calculation. And it's really simple. And if you have access to Groovy, what you will see is the first thing when you open up a form, change your view from designer to edit. And then when this happens, you'll see a drop down over on the right over here. And the script type will be set to calc script, and you change that to Groovy script. One note is if you're writing this on an ASO cube, this box over here will not exist. Or actually, I think it will exist, but it only allows Groovy script to be selected. So you don't have a calc script. It's not a BSO calculation engine in an ASO cube. So you don't even have the option to change that. So once you change this, you can start writing your Groovy right in here in the calc window, just like you would a normal calculation script. So this is a really simple example. It doesn't really do anything or interact with the form, but it'll give you an example of how to start. So there is a function called printLine in Groovy that will print out to your logs. So the first thing I'm doing here is I'm writing out executed by, and then one of the methods that you have on operation is operation.user.fullname, which gives the full name of the user, whatever they've entered into their profile. And then down here, there's another option in the API called current time millis, which is milliseconds. And there's probably 1,000 different ways to get a date. So other people might have a more efficient or a less efficient or a better way for whatever reason to get a date. But this is in the example just the way that I've done it. So note that there's tons of ways to do this. And I don't know that anyone's right or wrong. But what I'm doing is I'm getting the current time in milliseconds, and then I'm creating an object to get the current date, and I'm setting that equal to whatever the milliseconds is and making that a date. And then I'm creating a date format object that changes it to month, day, year, hours, minutes, and seconds. And I do note here, if you change the capital H's to lowercase h's, then the format will be a little bit different, and it'll be in AM and PM and not military time. So far what I've done is I printed out this line right here, and I have printed out executed at and the date and the time. So if I go to the log and I look at this message, what I'll see is Kyle Goodfriend, executed at 10:18, and then the time. So I did this a couple days ago. So something that's really, really simple. Other things that you can log out, you can do date, time, you can do user information, you can do the point of view that they changed, what cells they changed. So there's all kinds of things that you can log out to the log if it's something that you think would be valuable in managing your application. So we're going to go into a data entry example. Sorry about that. All right, so again, it's kind of hard without seeing faces and seeing hands raised if this is sinking in and makes sense. So you're more than welcome to ask a question if you need to. I don't see any more questions right now. So this is something that you guys will use all the time, is looping through cells. So the way you loop through a cell is that you use operation.grid.dataCellIterator.each. So basically what this is doing is it's looping through each cell in the grid that the person sees. And then inside of that, this is more of a Java, or I mean a Groovy function. I'm just basically saying that I want to use cell as a reference inside of this loop to reference whatever cell I'm on. And you could call this cell, you could call it, I don't know, edited cell, whatever you want to call it. So inside of here, I'm doing a very basic validation. And this validation is on an example that I can show you in a second. But what I'm doing is I'm saying if the cell is less than 0, then I want to set the background color to a random color of red. If it's less than 100, I want to set the background color to a different different iteration of color that's based on white. If it's less than 500, so between 100 or greater than 100 and less than 500, then it's going to make it yellow, else it makes it green. The other options, which you'll probably use, sorry, my laptop is a little bit slow to respond. So my next the other option that you'll probably use more frequently is if you change this data cell and you add cell.edited, it's only going to loop through the cells that are actually edited. Again, something that you'll probably use a little bit more often than looping through every cell in the form. The other thing that you can do is you can, inside that cell iterator, you can only iterate through certain columns and rows. So in this case, I'm assuming salary is on the row and January is in the column. I'm only going to loop through that information. So we're going to kind of take this a step a little bit further, and this time we're going to iterate through each cell, and we're going to validate a number to make sure that it's greater than 0 and less than 100. So as we're looping through the cells, you'll see that I have an if statement here, cell.data if it's less than 0, or if cell.data is greater than 100. If it's less than 0 or greater than 100, then I want to add a value that says that the value must be between 1 and 100. And actually this error message is probably a little bit wrong. It probably should say between 0 and 100. We're assuming integers that are going to be loaded here. Same thing, if I only want to loop through the cells that are edited, I just change it down here to only loop through the edited cells, and then I apply the same thing. Again, this second thing is, the second example is probably something that's a little bit more relevant to what you'd be doing. You can assume that the numbers that are there have already been validated, so there's really no reason to validate again. All right, I'm going to jump and see if there's any questions. All right, so we have a couple more questions. Is there a class method to identify a tab form in a composite form and iterate through the tabs in it? I do not believe there is. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I'm fairly certain. I have not seen that ability. Next question, is it possible to call external web services from Groovy? It is not at this point. I don't know if they're going to make that available. I think as security maybe improves, and I don't know, maybe you can set up a pipe or a VPN or tunnel or something. Maybe they'll allow that, but right now there is not the ability to do that. Great questions. All right, so validating a runtime prompt. So this one is actually really simple, same concept. It's a little bit odd how you identify runtime prompts, and if you're looking at an example, you're probably going to think it's a comment, and it's not. So inside here, I have RTPS : so you actually put it inside of like an S-based comment, and then you have to put RTPS : and then inside of that you put your runtime prompts in the squiggly brackets. In this example, I have these split by commas. I have had this work with commas, but the documentation actually has spaces. So I probably recommend that you don't use commas because it may not work at some point. So in this example, I've got product description as a runtime prompt, company, store type, whatever you have these named. And I typically name my runtime prompts and I prefix them with RTP. That's the only reason that RTP is there. It has no significance to a runtime prompt. It's just the naming convention that I typically use when I create these. The next thing I'm going to do is create a string variable, and we're going to use this in a later example, so I'm going to skip that for now. I create a max size of 20, and I'm going to use that in my validation here shortly. And then I'm determining the length of the description that I entered. So I set entered value equal to RTPS dot, and then the runtime name, and then dot get entered value. And this returns what the value is that was entered. And there are probably 6 to 10 different methods on top of this runtime prompt. There's get s-base value, get fixed value. There's many things. If you have a runtime prompt that's a date, there are get methods for the dates. So you'll have to look that up to get the right one for your type of runtime prompt. But in this example, it's just a string. And then I'm defining messages or error messages to be identified here. So I think I have an example of this a little bit later. This kind of runs together. I'll actually run through it just to kind of give you an idea. So with runtime prompts, you have the ability, and a lot of the error messages in the validation, you have the ability to create these objects, these message bundle objects that have error messages for the error that you want to show. So in this case, I've got 2 validations: 1, special characters, and 2, that it's no bigger than 20. So it's kind of hard to read, but basically what I have done here is I've created a message bundle where I've said validation.invalid product description, and then the error that I want to show. Okay. And then the next one is validation.invalid characters, and then the description that I want to show if that fails. And then you create a message bundle loader that loads these message bundles. And the reason you have to do this is because you can actually create an English version, a Spanish version, a French version, any type of locale that might be applicable. So then down here, I have the validation where I say if the entered value size, which is the length of the string, is greater than the max size, which is 20, then I throw an exception. So it's throw veto exception, and then MLB, which is the message bundle loader up here, and then which error I want to show the user. So in this case, I want validation.invalid product description. Same thing on the special characters. So if the entered value dot matches, and then if it matches A to Z or capital A to Z, 0 through 9, and right now I have a space, an underscore, and a dash. As long as there are no characters that are not or that are outside of this, or if there are characters that are outside of what I'm defining here, then I throw an exception with the validation.invalid character, and then the runtime prompt. So that would display only alphanumeric characters are allowed in product names. All right, I'm going to check my. We've got a couple more questions. So can the data cell iterator take functions like iDescendants and @children? Yes, it can. Yes and no. So the data cell iterator just iterates through the grid that you have. So the grid can take advantage of those functions, absolutely. If you want to do something and create grids or things outside of what the user sees, you can actually create a grid with a method that's a grid builder, or a class called grid builder, and you can actually use these functions like iDescendant and children and so on. So yes, you can use them, but you can't use them inside of the method of data cell iterator or the class, but you can use them inside of the ability to create the grid that you're actually iterating through. Are these runtime prompts members or member types? I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly what you're asking here. I'm going to assume that you're asking if what type of runtime prompt is it? Is it a member, or is it a string, or is it a date, and so on? The one that the example that I actually showed with the product description was a string or a text, so you can input anything. RTP company, in this example, we're not using it here in this presentation slide, but the company and the store type and some of those other things, version scenario, those would be member types. All right, customized calculations. This is something that you're going to use all the time. So there's huge benefit to this in performance in a lot of different ways. So we have the ability to change a fix or use a fix on the POV. You can pass those with runtime prompts through into a calculation. We've never had the ability to actually do the same thing on rows and columns. So if you think about looping through the rows and columns to only get the edited cells, you can theoretically now fix on only the rows and columns that you need to fix on. So a very different concept that is completely new and that we have the ability to do. Like I said, the S-based calculations run faster. The smart pushes run a lot faster. You can do, like I said, data synchronization between models. Those run a lot faster. So everything is improved by this. And the reality is there's no reason to run a calculation on 1,000 rows if you've only changed 2 rows. So we'll go through a couple examples. Again, the POV can be used in fixed statements and makes the process a lot more dynamic. And I'll explain why I prefer to do this rather than to still use the runtime prompts like we always have in the past. And I'm giving you this example of defining a POV members variable to get all of the members that are in the POV. So the way you do that is operation.grid.pov star.sbase member name. And that's going to give you a delimited list of all of the members that are in the POV. So identifying the edited cells would be the next piece. So we already have the point of view that we need to fix on. So the next thing we're going to do is loop through the edited cells and create a list of columns and rows. So in this example, if you think of the months going across the columns and the products going down the rows, this is how this is going to work. So we've defined variables for a list of edited products and edited months. And then we're going to loop through the cells. So operation.grid.dataCellIterator. And then we're going to loop through only the edited cells. So for each edited cell, I want to do an action as I'm looping through these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, whatever that cell is, I want to add cell.getMemberName product to the edited products list. I also want to get the period name. And you'll notice a little bit of a different methodology here than what I've shown before, and even the two of these are a little bit different. So get member name, you can actually get any dimension you want. There are some predefined ones for I believe it has for all 6 of the required dimensions, like get period name, get scenario, get, the ones that you can't change the names on. You've got predefined methods for those, and you don't have to actually pass the member name if you don't want to. So really what I'm doing here is I'm looping through all the cells and I'm creating a list of the products and the months that have changed. Okay, and then in this case, I have quarters and years in the grid. So I'm going to remove those members from the edited months variable that has the list of all the months that have changed. So to build the calculation, we're going to create what Groovy calls as a string builder. It's really the ability to kind of append strings to one variable. So I've just called it S for string and then ESS calc. So this is going to be the string that we actually create dynamically to run the calculation or to send the calculation to SBase or planning. So notice the fixed statement. I've got POV members.join. So what I'm doing is I'm taking, I go back to this slide. So the POV members is a collection of all of the member names. So I'm converting that to a delimited list with quotes around it. Same thing for the edited products and the edited months. The only difference here is I've got a .unique. So I'm basically taking out, any product that was replicated or month that was replicated to get a unique list. And then revenue equals units times price. That's just a generic calculation for this example, and my end fix. So if I look at, one more thing, and then initiating the calculation once we've created that string. And what I have here is if the edited product size is 0, then I just want to print out to the log that no data was changed, and I do not want to run the calculation. And think about the edited products would be 0, there would be no members in that variable that we've created because there were no edited cells, so it'd be blank. So if there are edited products, then what I want to do is I want to print the calculation that we've created dynamically to the log, and then I want to return that string so that it gets executed, and that's how you actually execute the calculation. So the whole thing looks like this, and hopefully this will make sense here in just a second. So the first piece, I've got the variables that I'm creating. I'm getting the POV, and I'm creating the months and the product variables. I'm creating the string. And the reason I put this all in one is so you guys had it all in one when you download this presentation. I'm looping through the cells and I'm creating the list of products and months that changed. And then I'm creating the calculation string. And then at the bottom, I'm sending that string as long as somebody's changed something. So really what this is doing, and I think this is where it kind of makes it clear. If you look at this, I've got a grid on the top, and this is an example grid that I've changed. And then I've got what the log has written to it on the bottom. And the log is basically writing out the calculation that we dynamically generate. So if you look here, I've got in the fixed statement, I've got local, BILB, computers, CO1, I've got all those list of members. Those list of members are in green because those come from the point of view that are highlighted in green in the form. It's just a one-to-one correlation. The second line is the list of products that we have. So if you look at the form, and you can tell by what's edited is yellow, I've edited 6 different products. You'll notice that in the red line in the log, I have those 6 products listed there. I don't have anything else, it's only those 6. And you'll also notice that January and April are the only 2 months that I changed, and I've got January and April in the fixed statement. So I hope this screen actually brings it together to make a little bit more sense. And again, I know I'm going through these really, really quickly. So let's see if we have any questions. All right, no more questions. So again, like I said, I've got 45 minutes to an hour to get you guys through this. And I hope it makes sense. And what I'm hoping is that you download the presentation and then use the examples to try to kickstart your knowledge on how to get integrated and start using these things. So synchronizing with the reporting type. It is 12:50, and I want to allow us to have some time for questions at the end. There's a couple things that I want to make sure that I cover at the end. So I'm gonna do this real quickly. And again, I hope you guys will download this and read through it, because if what I've gone through so far makes sense, this will make sense too. But there are 2 things. Once we've identified the calculation, we've dynamically created the SBase calculation. We're going to dynamically generate the smart push. So I've talked a little bit about how these smart pushes are used, and if you look in the middle there, basically what I'm doing is I'm executing a smart push and I'm overriding whatever I want to override. For me, I put in every dimension in there just so to me it makes sense and I can read it in a script. I personally like to use data maps and then create a smart list off of the data map, because what I found is if you have smart pushes on the forms If somebody changes the form, or if another admin comes in and sees that there's a smart push that doesn't execute on save that you're accessing through Groovy, they might delete it. So I don't even put them on the forms anymore. I just create a generic data map, and then I customize that data map every time I run a smart push. Real simple here. Everything up here in the top is basically what we did in the S-base calculation, except we're assuming that we're looping through the edited cells. We're creating a list of the products and the months. Same thing, okay? We've got the POV, again, exactly the same thing. The difference is that it's a little bit different with a smart push, because these are called collections that it accepts. So basically what I've done here is I've said I'm going to loop through each one of the POV members, and I'm going to add a map of the dimension name and the member name associated to that dimension to the map. Also, I'm going to add product and then the list of all the products that have been edited, the period, and the list of periods that have been edited. And then this is how it gets executed: operation.application.getSmartMap, the name of the smart map, of the data map, excuse me. And then I'm going to create a smart push from that and then execute this POV map. This is the variable that we just created up here with all of the overrides. So really what it does is down here is this is basically what it writes out. So when I'm executing, currency is local, company is BILB, department is computers, and so on. So this gives you an idea of what that actually creates. So if you don't want to use a data map, you can actually write these strings out independently. I just think this is a lot clearer. It's 3 lines as opposed to getting variables for 8 to 10 different dimensions and writing it out that way. I just think it's a cleaner way to do it. So runtime prompts. We've already talked about runtime prompts, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. When you download this, this will explain a little bit more about the message bundles that I talked about and how they're formatted. So we talk about the message bundle, we talk about the message loader, and there's a link down here where you can actually get all the locales. So EN is for English. They're different for obviously every language. So this example breaks out exactly what we did before, except I have an English message bundle and I have a Spanish message bundle. So I have the different strings and conversions here. And then I create this message bundle loader, which is exactly what I did before, but the only thing I had was English. This time I'm adding Spanish. So depending on the user's settings of their browser, if they are an English speaking person, then it'll come up as English. If they're Spanish speaking, it'll come up as Spanish. So it's actually pretty cool. We've already gone through an example of the validation on data. The one thing to keep in mind is that all of these rules need to be executed, run before save. So remember to check that, otherwise it'll get confusing because it won't run and it won't stop the save. It'll notify the user that something's wrong, but it'll still save the data and you'll get confused as to what's working. This example, again, same thing that we did before, except in this one, making sure that it's between -10 and 30%. And you'll notice that up here, if it.data is greater than 0.3 or it's less than 0.1 and there's no cell note. So that's how you tell right here if there's a cell note. So this is all the validation that I did on that example that I showed you earlier. Again, the example of the runtime prompt, which we've already talked about, but it's kind of all written out here in the demo. So next steps, let me check to see if there's any more questions. All right, so several more questions. Is there a way to have a Groovy business rule to call a non-Groovy business rule? Yes, there is. So if you have ever embedded a rule into another rule or a script into another rule, it's the exact same syntax. So I'm going to take a couple notes here. So I'm going to send out an example of that to everybody. Just give me just a second. I'll write this down. All right, I will make sure I send that out. And there was something else earlier that somebody asked, and I'll go through these questions and make sure that I send out responses to these. Oh, it was looping through the grids, I think, on a composite grid. All right, these are great questions. So the next one, is there any documentation available to give performance comparisons between business rules, calcs, and Groovy? I will tell you this. If you have a BSO, a non-Groovy rule, and you have a Groovy rule that does exactly the same thing, they're going to give you the exact same result. So Groovy does not make Essbase faster. It gives you the ability to make your fixed statement more isolated on only what needs to be changed. So if you dynamically generate a business rule that's exactly the same as what you would do without it being dynamically generated, you're going to get exactly the same results. So hopefully that makes sense. If not, go ahead and ask another question. Can we improve the aggregations with Groovy? So with Groovy alone, no. But what I have done is every time somebody saves a form, I push the data to the ASO cube on save, and because you can isolate only what's been edited, that push is really quick. So, theoretically, you don't have to I don't even do any consolidations anymore, because what I do is I move the data from the BSO cube to the ASO cube, or I just write directly to the ASO cube, and then from that ASO cube, I move the totals over to the P&L cube. So all of my workforce, product, CapEx, projects, all that stuff, if somebody makes a change to one line, you can see it in every other model immediately because of the ability to basically grab from an ASO cube, which is already consolidated. And I will write a note. I'll send out a link to another presentation that I did with ODTUG that actually walks through that. And I also did a presentation at Kscope last year that specifically talks about how to do what I just walked through. So I will send those links out. General question, does Groovy interact with workflow, valid intersections, copying attached documents, and supporting detail? I do not believe it does. I have not seen anything that allows you to do that. I'm quite certain on workforce. I haven't looked at supporting detail. I think you can probably check to see if there's supporting detail, but I don't know that you can interact with it. All right, and Karen said it's okay if I go a little bit longer, which is great because these are some really good questions. See if there are any other questions in here. And again, if anybody wants to reach out to me individually, again, my email is kgoodfriend@accelytics.com, and it's ACCELYTICS. And if you can't remember that, you can go to Into Hyperion, and you can reach me that way. All right, so I think I've answered the questions that are here. I'm gonna hit a couple of these slides. So other uses that I didn't talk about, metadata management. This is a crazy thought, and you can actually do this. So you know that you can have smart lists associated with dimensions. So think about if you wanted to use that to actually do transfers, right? It'd be great if you can do that, which you can. On the metadata management, if you have somebody or give somebody the ability to enter a new name for, say, a new employee, so in Workforce, instead of it being a TBH, you can actually ask them for the name, and you could actually create a member that actually has that name. You could give them the ability to delete members, to rename members, to do moves, change properties, consolidation properties. I don't know that I would want users to be able to do this, and I do have a note here that development has said that they're going to lock that. So if you have a form that actually does any adds or deletes, you have to be an admin to be able to do it, which I think is a good thing. It's kind of one of those things, you know, the old Spider-Man movie, if you were with great power becomes great responsibility. So it's nice they give us the ability to give users the ability to do something like this. I just don't know how practical it would be, because I certainly wouldn't want every user having the ability to delete members, for example. Moving data from ASO to BSO. So this is a huge performance increase with this whole real-time consolidated synchronization that I've talked about, which I'm not focusing on in this presentation, but I have done presentations that talk specifically about it, and I think it might be valuable to, I'll make sure Karen has the link to send out to everybody so they can see that. I do know that there is an item in the roadmap to be able to have smart pushes and data maps actually push from ASO to BSO. So at some point, you won't have to use the grid builder inside of Groovy to do this. You'll be able to do it with the smart pushes. I don't know when that's going to be. I just know that they've talked about it. And, you know, as with anything with Oracle, it's, you know, they got a lot on their plate too. So there's a lot of things that need to be done before that actually comes to fruition. Executing business logic directly in ASO. Think about this. What if you never wrote a BSO calculation ever again, and you never used a BSO cube, and everything was done in ASO? We actually have clients that we've done this with where we don't even use BSO. Everything's done in ASO. So the forms are connected to ASO, and all of the business logic is done in Groovy. And I never thought in a million years, you know, when I got into this, that I would ever talk about using Essbase without writing a calculation in Essbase. So that's a crazy thought, but it removes the synchronizations, it removes any consolidations that you need to do. So there's a lot of benefits to doing it that way. You can move some logic outside of calculations that might improve performance. And again, Essbase isn't going to change. If you write a Groovy calculation to do A and you just write a BSO calculation to do A, it's going to take exactly the same amount of time. But there are some functions inside of Essbase that aren't very performance friendly, like strings, concatenations, substrings. And there's even a lot of things that you can't even do that you might want to do. So there's a lot of things that you can actually do in Groovy to bypass what you can't do or what's slow in Essbase and dynamically generate the Essbase calculation so that those manipulations aren't done in the BSO calc engine. You have access to smart list labels. So if you want to do a transfer of somebody and you have a smart list that's connected to an entity dimension and a person selects a new entity, you have the ability now to get that string, not just the number that's associated with it, and then actually do the transfer. So, you know, copy data from member 123 to member XYZ. So those are huge benefits that we have. The validation on on runtime prompts and even in grids is just so much more vast than what we ever had the ability to do before. So this is important, I think, and I think it's really critical to not get frustrated and be really patient when you're learning this. So when I started this, it was right after it came out and there was literally no documentation. Nobody had blogged about it. It was just the APIs from Oracle that I had to learn from. And so from somebody that doesn't have a background in coding, you know, I like to learn new technologies. I literally have zero formal education, so I've never been in a class that's taught me anything that I've learned from a technology perspective. There are three different things I think you should focus on. One is learning Groovy, because there are a lot of things that I saw examples on and other people that were doing it inside our organization that I'd say, I don't know how you found that. Like POV star.essbase member names, you won't find that in the API. And they would always come back and say, well, if you know Groovy, you would know that exists. So there's a lot of things that you're going to see in the examples that I've given and examples that other people that have given that are confusing because you don't know Groovy. And the more I learn about Groovy, the more things I have the ability to do. So the first thing is focus on Groovy. The next one is understanding the Essbase API. Then the third one is, you know, learn how to use those together to be productive. So, this is when I would struggle with something, and I thought it was a lack of documentation with the API. It was actually the fact that I didn't know enough about Groovy to know how to use the documentation that Oracle has for the API. So I would encourage everybody to look at those two different things separately. And if you can't get something to work, identify whether it's you're reading the API wrong or you don't know how to use the API because you don't know how to use Groovy. So I compartmentalize those things into buckets, and it really, really helped me figure things out when I got stuck. And kind of my learning progression, it was almost like, the stages of death. I got really, really frustrated and thought it was way too complicated for me to learn. And then once I started to become a little bit productive and I learned from some of the examples that we had internally, your knowledge is going to grow super fast around the API. But Groovy, you're probably not going to understand quite as much because you're just going to replicate examples. At some point, your knowledge of Groovy and API is going to kind of measure up and be connected from an advancement level. And the more you learn about one, the more you're going to learn about the other. And you just become more comfortable and more productive. And I think at first you'll probably become more productive with the API, and you'll learn more about that from a knowledge perspective. And then your Groovy is going to kind of catch up. So like I said, I think it's great if you compartmentalize whether it's a Groovy issue or whether it's an API issue. I think it'll save you a lot of time. All right, so we have one more question, and then I'll just throw out some of these tips. I like the idea of using ASO only. Does PBCS allow to build web forms on top of ASO without using BSO? Absolutely it does. It's supported, and it absolutely does that. So go to town, enjoy, and I think you'll actually be really excited. I will tell you that there are some things, depending on how big your application is, that you will struggle with. Grid builders can only be so big, so you're going to have to loop through either predefined or dynamically generated intersections to make sure that those grids are small to where you can go through to do calculations. And those are more on things like allocations and global calculations that you're going to need to run. Anything on a web form that gets saved, I've never had any issues with. So, all right, so a couple quick notes, and these are just things hopefully that will help you eliminate some frustration. First thing is, be careful when you copy examples from either a PowerPoint presentation or a website into your Groovy. You will get errors and they won't make any sense. And the reason may be, is because of the quotes, the double quotes and the single quotes. And if you look at this slide, Word and some other applications will automatically, change your quotes to the open and close quote. And if you copy those into Groovy, they don't recognize those as quotes and single quotes. So make sure that your quotes and single quotes inside of Groovy are the vertical lines. Users don't have access to data maps, and I learned that the hard way. I built a whole bunch of stuff on data map because I was an admin and it worked. And then I had to go through and change everything to the Smart Push, which wasn't a big deal after I figured out what needed to be done, but save yourself the hassle. Always use closers when possible. So I think the things that are critical on that is when you open up a grid builder, you can actually open it up with a closure on it. And I have examples of that will be in some of the presentations that I send out to you guys. Use Printline to help diagnose issues. I actually have a great blog on how to iterate through a grid and print out the value so that you can actually copy the log and paste it into Excel as a delimited list, and you'll actually have a Smart View retrieve immediately. And it will help you diagnose, what's going, where in the code it's wrong. Groovy has a free editor. It's not great, but it's free, and you can use that. So a lot of times I'll test things in the Groovy editor that aren't specific to the API for PBCS. So learning collections and variables and things like that I'll do because it's easier to figure out what you're doing wrong in that than it is to run a calculation and look at a log. Learn about Groovy collections, how to manipulate, create, and delete them. That's probably the one thing that I wish somebody would have told me when I first started, go out, and I have some blogs on this as well, understand what collections are. They're lists and maps basically. And if you understand how to manipulate those, your code will get much, much, much simpler and much easier to read, and also much more reusable. So if there was one thing I would recommend focusing on, is going out and learning about what a collection is and how to use those. Use scripts to hold common code. So you can create functions just like you can in Groovy. So you can reuse those, pass parameters to them, so on. The other thing is, and I'll send this out because somebody asked about it, can you embed another calculation that's not Groovy into a Groovy calculation? And the answer is yes. So there's a lot of things that I'll create a script with common things like getting the month name from a month number and vice versa, that I actually have in a function, and I just embed that, or in a script, and I embed that script into every calculation I build so that all those things are there if I need them. And again, you can go to Into Hyperion or into Oracle.com, and I have tons of tons of articles out there. And I actually work directly with development, and development has pushed a lot of people. So anytime I have a challenge or a problem, I have a direct line to those guys, and they help me with it because of what I have out there. So I think you can trust what I have out there is pretty good and accurate. And good, I guess, is a relative term. Again, my email here, and if you guys want a one-on-one demo, or there's something that I didn't talk about that you would like to understand, if you want to email me, maybe we can set up some time to do that. I think we've got one more question. Can grids be generated on the fly using Groovy? Yes, they can. And it's the best way to move data from ASO to BSO. And it's a great way to do global calculations like currency conversions and things like that. So again, I'll send out a link to some specific articles and presentations that I did specifically for that you guys can look at. So we've gone 10 minutes over. I apologize for running through some of this stuff quickly, but like I said, if you guys have any questions, my email is here. You're more than welcome to email me. I'd be happy to help if I can. I love teaching people. I love sharing knowledge, and as much as I hopefully will be able to teach and share with you, I'll probably get back in your ideas. So I have no problem helping people. So I think we're done. We don't have any more questions, and like I said, we're a little bit over on time. So thank you guys for joining, and I hope it was valuable, and hope to talk to you or see you at the K-Scope in Seattle next year. So thanks again for your time. Thank you.